Every person knows the sting of being told they're not enough. Clara Whitmore had heard those words her entire life in the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, 1847. The townsfolk whispered she was too small, too weak for the harsh West. They laughed. Behind her back, certain no man would ever want her. Then mountain man Silas Grizzly McGraw rode into town. He was everything she wasn't. Tall, strong, feared by most. But when he looked at Clara, he saw something different. He saw her courage, her heart, her unbreakable spirit. "She's perfect for me," he told the whole town. Now Clara would face the ultimate test in Grizzly's dangerous mountain world. Wild animals, deadly storms, and complete isolation awaited her. Could the woman everyone called too small prove them all wrong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Clara Whitmore swept the wooden porch of Henderson's General Store with practiced efficiency, her small hands gripping the worn broom handle as she worked. At 23, she had grown accustomed to the routine that filled her days. Sweeping, stocking shelves, measuring out flour and sugar for the town's wives, who spoke around her as if she weren't there. "Poor little thing," Mrs. Patterson had whispered just yesterday while purchasing thread. "Pretty enough, I suppose, but what man wants a wife he'd have to worry about breaking?" Clara had continued weighing out the woman's order without flinching, her face a mask of practiced composure. She had learned long ago that showing hurt only gave them more ammunition. Her mother's delicate gold wedding ring, which she wore on a chain around her neck, pressed against her heart, a reminder that love had found her mother despite her petite stature. But her mother had died when Clara was 15, taking with her the only voice that had ever called Clara's size a blessing. The town bell, mounted high on its post in the center of the square, chimed 8 times. Clara paused in her sweeping to listen, as she always did. That bell governed every aspect of life in Cedar Ridge, calling people to church, announcing births and deaths, warning of danger. Its bronze voice had marked every milestone of her life, including the day they'd rung it 23 times to honor her mother's passing. "Clara, quit your dawdling and get these crates sorted," barked Ezra Henderson from inside the store. At 64, he was a fair employer, but had little patience for what he called female contemplation. She set the broom aside and entered the dim interior of the store, breathing in the familiar scents of leather, coffee beans, and lamp oil. 3 wooden crates sat beside the counter, filled with goods from the latest supply wagon. Clara began, unpacking bolts of fabric, her fingers automatically assessing the quality and texture. Her needlework was among the finest in town, though even that skill earned her backhanded compliments. "Useful for mending, I suppose," the banker's wife had once remarked, "though what good are delicate stitches when you need someone who can wrestle a calf or haul water buckets?" The bell above the store's door chimed as Widow Morrison entered, her black dress rustling against the doorframe. At 57, she had appointed herself the town's unofficial guardian of propriety and marriage prospects. "Morning, Clara, dear," she said, though her tone carried its usual note of pity. "I was just speaking with Reverend Walsh about the upcoming harvest dance. Such a shame you've never found a partner for these occasions," Clara continued, unpacking without looking up. "I manage just fine, Mrs. Morrison." "Oh, I'm sure you do, dear. But dancing alone doesn't catch a husband." She leaned conspiratorially across the counter. "Though between you and me, I can't imagine any of our local men would suit you anyway. You need someone gentler, perhaps a shopkeeper from back east who wouldn't expect you to handle frontier hardships." The words stung as they were meant. "To do," Clara folded a bolt of blue calico with extra care, using the moment to steady herself. "Perhaps I'm not looking for a husband who sees me as fragile, Mrs. Morrison." The older woman's eyebrows rose. "Well, that's the spirit, I suppose. Though you might want to be realistic about your prospects, dear. A woman your size needs to be Practical. After Mrs. Morrison left with her purchases, Clara found herself alone in the store. Henderson had gone to the bank, leaving her to mind the counter. She walked to the small mirror behind the dry goods section and studied her reflection. Honestly, at barely 5 feet tall, with delicate features and hands that had never known calluses from heavy labor, she understood why people saw her as unsuited for frontier life. Her green eyes held intelligence and determination, but those qualities seemed invisible to most folks. The town of Cedar Ridge had grown around the lumber mill and the cattle drives that passed through twice a year. It was a place that valued physical strength and endurance above all else. Women were expected to bear children, manage households that included livestock, preserve meat, and help defend their homes when necessary. In such a world, Clara's skills, with needle and thread, her ability to calculate figures quickly, and her gift for reading people's needs seemed as delicate and useless as lace doilies. She returned to her work, methodically arranging the new inventory. A set of cooking pots reminded her of the boarding house where she lived, paying rent from her meager wages. Her small room under the eaves was barely large enough for a bed and washstand, but it was hers. She had sewn the curtains herself and embroidered wildflowers on the pillowcase, creating beauty in a space others might consider cramped and cheerless. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, mostly women preparing for the week ahead. Clara served them with quiet efficiency, measuring out their needs and totaling their purchases with quick accuracy. But as always, she remained part of the background, noticed only when they needed something retrieved from a high shelf, which usually required Henderson's stepladder. "Honestly, Clara," laughed Miss Jenny Sullivan, the blacksmith's daughter, "you're like a little bird trying to reach the clouds. Maybe you should stick to ground-level living." The comment drew chuckles from the other customers, and Clara forced a smile. She had learned that responding defensively only made things worse. Better to let them have their moment of superiority and move on to the next task. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, casting the town in golden evening light, Clara was closing up the store when she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the mountain pass. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes with her hand as she looked toward the sound. A lone rider emerged from the tree line, silhouetted against the dying light. Even from a distance, his size was imposing. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in wild places, his broad shoulders and commanding presence unmistakable even in silhouette. Other townspeople had noticed him too. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people stepped out of buildings to watch his approach. There was something about him that demanded attention, not just his size, but the way he carried himself. This was no ordinary drifter or cattle hand. As he drew closer, Clara could make out more details. His horse was a sturdy mountain breed, built for rough terrain rather than speed. The man himself was tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. His clothes were well made but worn, the kind of gear that prioritized function over fashion. A rifle rested across his saddle, and she glimpsed the handle of a knife at his belt, but it was his eyes that caught her attention as he rode past the general store. Dark and measuring, they swept the town with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. For just a moment, those eyes met hers across the dusty street, and Clara felt something she had never experienced before, the sense of being truly seen, not dismissed or pitied, but acknowledged as worthy of notice. The rider continued toward the saloon, where he would likely seek a room and a meal. Behind Clara, she heard the whispered conversations beginning, the way news spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. "Biggest man I ever seen," muttered old Pete from the barber shop. "Mountain man by the look of him," added the banker. "Probably been trapping up in the high country." "Handsome enough," giggled one of the younger women. "If you like the dangerous type." Clara lingered on the porch longer than necessary, watching as the stranger dismounted outside the saloon. His movements were fluid despite his size, speaking of strength held in careful control. When he looked back toward the general store one more time before entering the saloon, Clara felt her heart skip unexpectedly. She finished locking up and walked home through streets alive with speculation about the newcomer. In her small room, she prepared for bed with her usual routine, but found herself repeatedly glancing toward the window that faced the saloon. A warm yellow glow spilled from its windows, and she wondered what the mountain man was doing inside. Was he the kind of man who drank alone, or did he share stories of his wilderness adventures? As she brushed out her long brown hair before the small mirror, Clara caught herself wondering what it would be like to be seen as strong instead of fragile, capable instead of delicate. The man's brief glance had carried no pity, no dismissive assessment of her size. For those few seconds, she had felt like a woman worthy of a mountain man's attention. The thought was foolish, of course. Men like him sought partners who could match their strength and endurance. They needed women who could handle isolation, danger, and the endless demands of frontier life. Clara braided her hair for sleep and tried to dismiss the stranger from her thoughts, but his dark eyes followed her into dreams where she was no longer too small for anything. 3 days after the mountain man's arrival, the town prepared for its monthly social dance. Clara had attended every one for the past 8 years, always hoping this time might be different, always leaving with the same familiar ache of disappointment. She pressed her best dress, a soft green wool that brought out her eyes, and pinned her hair up with the tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her. The community hall buzzed with excitement as families gathered for the evening's festivities. Lanterns cast warm circles of light across the wooden floor, and Mrs. Kowalski's fiddle filled the air with lively melodies. Clara sat with the other unmarried women along the wall, watching as couple after couple took to the floor. "Look at Martha Sullivan dancing with young Tom Bradley," whispered Ellen Reeves, nudging Clara with her elbow. "Third dance in a row. I'd say there'll be an announcement soon." Clara smiled politely and nodded, though her attention kept drifting toward the corner, where Silas McGraw, she had learned his name from Henderson, stood nursing a glass of something stronger than the punch being served to the ladies. He had cleaned up considerable since his arrival, his dark hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed, but he still carried himself with that same wilderness alertness that set him apart from every other man in the room. Several of the town's young women had made bold attempts to catch his attention, but he had politely declined all invitations to dance. Instead, he seemed content to observe, those dark eyes taking in everything with quiet intensity. "Don't even think about it, Clara," Ellen warned, following her gaze. "A man like that needs a woman who can keep up with him, someone with meat on her bones and strength in her arms." The words stung, as they always did, but Clara kept her expression neutral. She had grown expert at hiding her hurt feelings, at pretending the constant reminders of her inadequacy didn't wound her deeply. The music shifted to a slower waltz, and Clara watched as the married couples joined the dance floor, moving together, with the easy grace of long partnership. Her father had taught her to dance in their kitchen when she was small, before consumption had taken him too. She remembered standing on his boots as he guided her through the steps, telling her she was light as a feather and twice as beautiful. Miss Whitmore, the deep voice, startled her from her memories. Silas McGraw stood before her, his worn leather journal tucked under one arm, extending his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "Would you honor me with this dance?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Around them, conversation stopped mid-sentence as every eye in the hall turned toward them. She could feel the shock radiating from the other women, the disbelief that someone of his stature would choose her. She began, then stopped. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Never apologize for who you are, Clara. The right man will see your worth." She placed her small hand in his much larger one and allowed him to help her to her feet. "I would be honored, Mr. McGraw." His smile transformed his weathered face, revealing genuine warmth beneath the mountain man's rugged exterior. "Just Silas, if you please." As he led her onto the dance floor, Clara was acutely aware of every whispered comment, every incredulous stare. But when Silas's hand settled at her waist and he began to guide her through the waltz, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. He was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, his movements controlled and confident. Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm, following his lead with growing assurance. She felt almost weightless in his arms, as if she were floating instead of dancing. "You're very light on your feet," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I'm light everywhere else, too," she replied without thinking. Then, immediately, regretted the self-deprecating comment. Silas's hand tightened slightly at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer. "Light can be an advantage in rough country. Takes less to feed, less to clothe, and can move through places others can't." Before Clara could respond, the music ended, but Silas didn't immediately release her. For a moment they stood together in the center of the floor, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you for the dance," he said finally, his voice formal, but his eyes warm. "Thank you for asking," she managed to reply. As he escorted her back to her seat, Clara caught sight of several young men clustered near the refreshment table. Jake Morrison, the saloon-keeper's son, was among them, along with Buck Wheeler, whose father owned the largest ranch in the county. They were laughing among themselves, casting pointed looks in her direction. "Well, well," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the hall. "Looks like our mountain man has a taste for tiny things. Hope he doesn't step on her by mistake." The comment drew snickers from his companions, and Clara felt heat flood her cheeks. But before she could retreat to her chair, Silas's hand closed gently over her elbow. "Something amusing, gentlemen?" His voice was deceptively mild, but there was steel underneath that made Jake's laughter die abruptly. "No offense meant," Buck Wheeler said quickly, though his smirk remained. "Just wondering if you might be more comfortable with someone a little more substantial. Sarah here is available for the next dance." He gestured toward Sarah Collins, a tall, robust young woman who worked in her family's bakery. "I appreciate the suggestion," Silas replied, his tone remaining conversational even as the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "But I'm quite particular about my choices. Miss Whitmore suits me perfectly." The casual dismissal hit its mark. Jake's face flushed red, and he stepped forward aggressively. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here, stranger. A woman like Clara might look pretty on your arm, but she'd be useless when it comes to real work. What happens when you need someone who can actually pull her weight?" Clara felt the familiar shame begin to rise, the automatic urge to shrink, away from confrontation. But then Silas moved, not dramatically, simply shifting his position to place himself more fully between her and the hostile group. "I reckon that's between Miss Whitmore and me," he said quietly, "unless you have some particular claim on her attention." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Jake glanced around at his friends, realizing he had painted himself into a corner. Everyone knew he had never shown Clara any interest beyond cruel amusement. "Course not," he muttered. "Just trying to be helpful." "Your help isn't needed," Silas replied. He turned back to Clara, offering his arm. "Would you care to step outside for some air? It's gotten rather close in here." Clara accepted gratefully, allowing him to escort her through the curious crowd and out onto the hall's front porch. The evening air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. "I apologize for that unpleasantness," Silas said once they were alone. "Some men mistake cruelty for wit." "You don't need to apologize," Clara replied, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "They've been saying such things my whole life." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the moonlight. When he spoke again, his voice held a note of something she couldn't quite identify, respect, perhaps, or admiration. "Takes considerable strength to endure that kind of treatment and still carry yourself with dignity. most people would have. Left town long ago or let it break their spirit? Clara looked up at him in surprise. No one had ever called her strong before. I never thought of it that way. Then you're not seeing yourself clearly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the worn leather journal she had noticed earlier. I keep sketches of the country I've traveled through. Beautiful, wild places where strength comes in many forms. He opened the journal, revealing detailed drawings of mountain landscapes, wildlife, and remote cabins nestled in valleys. This is my world, Miss Whitmore. It's not easy, but it's honest. No one there cares if you're the biggest or the smallest. They only care if you're willing to do what needs doing. Clara studied the sketches, seeing the loneliness and longing that lay beneath the beautiful images. You live alone up there? For the past 5 years. His voice carried a weight of solitude that made her chest tight. Gets quiet sometimes. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she had never seen before on any man's face. Hope mixed with uncertainty, as if her answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. Miss Whitmore, he said carefully, I wonder if you might consider a change of scenery. My place up in the mountains could use a woman's touch, and I'd be honored to have someone of your character share it with me. The proposal hung between them, simple and direct. Clara felt her world tilt on its axis as she realized he was serious. This strong, capable man actually wanted her, not despite her size, but regardless of it. Behind them, the music and laughter. From the dance continued, but out here under the stars, everything had changed. Clara spent a sleepless night turning Silas's proposal over in her mind. By dawn, she had reached a decision that both terrified and exhilarated her. When she arrived at the general store that morning, her small sewing kit tucked under her arm, Henderson took one look at her face and shook his head. You're thinking of going with him, aren't you? The old storekeeper had always been perceptive about people's intentions. That mountain man's got you stirred up. He's offered me a chance at something different, Clara said carefully, arranging her sewing supplies on the counter. The leather case contained her mother's silver thimble, spools of thread in every color, needles of various sizes, and small scissors that fit perfectly in her hand. To most people it represented feminine delicacy, but Clara knew these tools had fed and clothed her for years. Different doesn't always mean better, girl. Henderson's weathered face creased with concern. You got a good life here, safe, predictable. That man's offering you wilderness and hardship. He's offering me respect, Clara replied quietly, threading a needle to mend a tear in a customer's shirt. When did you last see someone in this town look at me like I might be capable of something important? Henderson fell silent at that, unable to argue with the truth. Clara worked steadily through the morning, her hands moving with practiced skill as she repaired clothing, hemmed curtains, and reinforced worn seams. Each stitch was precise and strong, designed to last through hard use. Word of Silas's proposal had spread through the town like wildfire. By noon, Clara had endured a parade of well-meaning visitors, each determined to talk sense into her. Clara, dear, fretted Widow Morrison, wringing her hands dramatically. You can't seriously be considering this madness. That man is a stranger. You know nothing about him except that he's large and lives in the mountains. I know he treated me with kindness when others showed me mockery, Clara replied, setting tiny, even stitches in a baby's christening gown. I know he sees something worthwhile in me, but the danger, child. Wild animals, harsh weather, complete isolation. What if you fall ill? What if he turns out to be violent? What if I spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been? Clara cut her off gently. Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I'm 23 years old. If I don't take this chance now, when will I ever have another? Dr. Patterson arrived next, armed with medical arguments about the perils of mountain living. The nearest doctor would be days away, he warned. Childbirth complications, broken bones, fever, any number of things could kill you up there. People die here in town too, Clara pointed out, not looking up from her needlework. My mother died despite having you right down the street. The doctor's face reddened. but he couldn't dispute the truth of her words. Even Reverend Walsh made an appearance, concerned about the propriety of an unmarried woman going off with a man she barely knew. "Perhaps if Mr. McGraw were willing to court you properly for a season," he suggested delicately. "Marriage shouldn't be entered into hastily." "Reverend," Clara said, setting down her sewing to look at him directly, "how many seasons have I waited for someone in this town to court me properly? How many more should I wait?" The minister had no answer for that either. As the afternoon wore on, Clara's resolve only strengthened. Each visitor who tried to dissuade her only reinforced how little faith anyone had in her abilities. They saw only her small stature and delicate appearance, never the strength that had carried her through years of loneliness and disappointment. When Silas appeared in the doorway as the sun was setting, Clara's heart lifted at the sight of him. He had spent the day making preparations, purchasing supplies, and arranging for transportation. His presence filled the store's entrance, solid and reassuring. "Have you given thought to my proposal?" he asked quietly, removing his hat in the presence of a lady. "I have," Clara replied, folding the completed christening gown with careful hands. "And I accept, if the offer still stands." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. "It stands. Are you certain? The life I'm offering isn't easy." "I'm not looking for easy," Clara said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I'm looking for a chance to prove what I'm capable of." Henderson emerged from the back room, where he had been discreetly listening to their conversation. "You'll need supplies," he said gruffly. "Can't send a woman into the mountains unprepared." He began pulling items from the shelves: warm clothing, sturdy boots, preserved foods. "Consider it a wedding gift." Clara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Despite his grumbling, Henderson had always been kind to her in his way. "We'll leave at first light," Silas told her. "Pack only what you truly need. Travel light up there is travel smart." Clara nodded, mentally cataloguing her few possessions. Most of her belongings could be left behind, but her sewing kit would come with her. Those tools represented not just her livelihood, but her identity as someone who could create and repair, who could make beautiful things from humble materials. That evening, Clara packed her small trunk with careful consideration. Her warmest dresses, undergarments, her mother's Bible, the gold wedding ring on its chain, and her precious sewing supplies. As she folded each item, she tried to envision her new life in the mountains with Silas. There would be challenges, certainly. She had never lived without the convenience of the general store, the doctor's proximity, the comfort of neighbors nearby. But there would also be freedom from the constant judgment, the pitying looks, the assumption that she was too small and weak to matter. A soft knock at her door interrupted her packing. She opened it to find young Mary Henderson, the storekeeper's granddaughter, holding a small wrapped package. "Grandpa wanted you to have this," the girl said shyly. "He said it might come in handy where you're going." Clara unwrapped the gift to find a compact sewing kit designed for travel, a leather roll that contained the essentials in a space no larger than a book. Inside was a note in Henderson's scratchy handwriting: "For mending more than clothes." Clara settled into bed for her last night in Cedar Ridge. She felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that kept sleep at bay. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter of her life, one where her worth would be measured not by her size, but by her character and determination. Through her small window, she could see the mountains rising dark against the starlit sky. Somewhere, up there among those peaks, was her future, uncertain, challenging, but filled with possibility. For the first time in her life, someone believed she was strong enough to face whatever lay ahead. The sewing kit sat ready beside her trunk, its tools worn smooth by years of faithful service. Tomorrow, those same tools would begin a new kind of work, helping to build a life where being small was no longer seen as a weakness, but simply as one way of being perfectly herself. The journey into the mountains took 3 days of steady travel through increasingly wild country. Clara rode a gentle mare that Silas had selected specifically for her, while he led a pack horse loaded with supplies. With each mile that passed, the familiar world of Cedar Ridge fell further behind, replaced by towering pines, rushing streams, and granite peaks that scraped the sky. Clara had never spent so much time outdoors, and by the end of the first day, every muscle in her body ached. Her hands, soft from indoor work, developed blisters from gripping the reins. But she endured without complaint, determined to prove herself worthy of Silas's faith in her. "You're doing well," Silas told her as they made camp beside a mountain lake on their second night. "Most folks from town would be complaining by now." "About the hardships. I've complained plenty," Clara admitted, flexing her sore fingers, "just not out loud." Silas chuckled at her honesty. "Honest woman, I appreciate that." He handed her a cup of coffee brewed over their small fire. "We'll reach my place tomorrow afternoon. It's not much to look at, but it's solid shelter." As Clara sipped the strong, bitter coffee, she watched Silas move around their campsite with easy efficiency. Every action was purposeful. Banking the fire for the night, checking their horses, scanning the tree line for potential threats. She was beginning to understand that survival in this wilderness required constant vigilance and practical knowledge she had never needed in town. The third day brought them to a narrow valley nestled between two ridges, where a log cabin sat beside a clear stream. Clara's first glimpse of her new home took her breath away, though not entirely in a good way. The structure was sturdy but rough, built for function rather than comfort. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating that Silas had arranged for the fire to be tended in his absence. "It's not fancy," Silas said, helping her down from her horse, "but the roof doesn't leak, and the walls keep out the wind." Clara approached the cabin with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The single room was larger than her boarding house quarters, but sparse in furnishings. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its carefully fitted stones radiating warmth throughout. The space, a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and shelving along the walls completed the interior. But it was the hearthstone itself that caught Clara's attention, a massive piece of granite that served as both the foundation and focal point of the room. Carved into its surface were the initials SM, along with symbols she didn't recognize. This was clearly the heart of Silas's home, the gathering place where he cooked his meals and spent his evenings. "My father helped me set that stone," Silas said, noticing her interest. "Took 4 men and a system of pulleys to get it into place. He said a hearth should be built to last generations." "It's beautiful," Clara said, running her hand over the smooth surface. "It makes the whole room feel solid, permanent." Over the following days, Clara began to learn the rhythms of mountain life. Each morning brought a list of essential tasks: tending the fire, preparing meals, checking their small garden plot, maintaining their equipment. Everything required more effort than its town equivalent. Water had to be carried from the stream, wood had to be split and stacked, food had to be preserved without the benefit of a nearby store. Clara's small size, which had been seen as a liability in town, began to reveal unexpected advantages. Her light weight allowed her to move easily across unstable logs when crossing streams. Her small hands proved perfect for detailed work, like cleaning fish or repairing intricate mechanisms. And her careful, precise nature, developed through years of fine needlework, served her well in tasks that required attention to detail. "You've got steady hands," Silas observed, as she successfully threaded a fishing line through a series of tiny eyelets. "That's worth more than brute strength in most situations." The first real test of her determination came during her second week in the mountains. A sudden autumn storm brought driving rain and fierce winds that threatened to tear the roof off. The cabin. Clara huddled beside the hearth as the walls shook around them, listening to trees crashing in the forest beyond. "Storm's not finished yet," Silas said, checking the door's reinforcing bar. "Could last through the night." As if responding to his words, a tremendous crack echoed through the valley, followed by a crash that shook the ground. Through the small window, Clara could see that a massive pine had fallen across the stream, damming the water and redirecting its flow toward their cabin. "We need to clear that tree before the water backs up enough to flood us out," Silas said grimly. "In this wind, it'll be dangerous work." Clara looked out at the storm raging beyond their walls. The idea of venturing out into that chaos terrified her, but she could see the water level already rising beside their cabin. "What can I do to help?" she asked. Silas paused in gathering his tools, studying her face in the firelight. "It's going to be cold, wet, and risky. You could stay here where it's safe." "Safe doesn't help if the cabin floods," Clara replied practically. "Tell me what you need." Working together in the howling storm, they managed to clear enough branches from the fallen tree to restore the stream's natural flow. Clara's small size allowed her to crawl into spaces where Silas couldn't fit, cutting away smaller branches and debris. By the time they returned to the cabin, both were soaked to the skin and shivering with cold, but their home was secure. As they sat before the hearthstone, warming themselves with hot coffee and dry clothes, Silas looked at Clara with something approaching amazement. "Most town folks would have expected me to handle that alone," he said quietly. "Most town folks never had to worry about their homes flooding," Clara replied, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not most town folks anymore." The storm passed by morning, leaving the valley washed clean and sparkling in the sunlight. As Clara stepped outside to assess any damage, she realized something fundamental had changed during the night. She no longer felt like a visitor in this wild place. She felt like someone who belonged here, someone who could meet its challenges and thrive. The hearthstone that had welcomed her that first day now represented something more than just the center of their home. It was the foundation of a partnership built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. Here in the mountains, beside this ancient stone, Clara was discovering that strength came in many forms, and that she possessed more of it than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. 3 weeks into her mountain life, Clara encountered her first bear. She was returning from the stream with a bucket of water when she spotted the massive black shape rummaging through their small garden plot. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stood frozen on the path, suddenly understanding why Silas wore his knife and rifle like extensions of himself. The bear, intent on the root vegetables they had been carefully tending, seemed unaware of her presence. Clara remembered Silas's instructions about wildlife encounters. Never run, make yourself appear large, back away slowly. But what did you do when you were already small, and the bear was between you and the safety of the cabin? The animal looked up then, fixing her with dark, intelligent eyes. For a terrifying moment, they regarded each other across the garden. Then the bear seemed to dismiss her as unthreatening and returned to its feast of turnips and carrots. Clara eased backward step by careful step, her bucket clutched in white-knuckled hands. When she finally reached the cabin, Silas emerged with his rifle already in hand, having heard her approach. "Black bear in the garden," she whispered, though her voice shook only slightly. Silas nodded approvingly at her composure. "You handled." "And that right. Most folks would have screamed or run, and either one could have provoked an attack." He moved to the window, studying the situation. Old male by the look of him, getting ready for winter sleep. "We'll let him finish and move on." "Will he come back?" Clara asked, setting down her bucket with hands that trembled only a little. "Possibly. Bears remember good food sources." Silas returned his rifle to its place above the hearth. "Time you learn to shoot properly. Can't always count on being near the cabin when trouble finds you." The next afternoon, Silas set up targets near the stream and began teaching Clara to handle firearms. The rifle felt impossibly heavy and awkward in her small hands at first, but Silas proved to be a patient instructor. "Don't fight the weight," he advised, adjusting her stance. "Let the rifle rest natural-like. Your size actually helps here, less of you to shake and throw off your aim." Clara's first shots went wild, the rifle's kick surprising her with its violence. But gradually, under Silas's careful guidance, she began to understand the weapon's rhythm. Her needlework training served her well. She was accustomed to precise, careful movements, to taking time to line up her work perfectly before making. Each stitch better, Silas said, as her shots began finding the target with increasing regularity. You've got steady hands and good eyes. That matters more than raw strength when it comes to shooting. As autumn deepened into early winter, Clara's education in mountain survival continued. Silas taught her to read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. She learned to identify edible plants, to preserve meat for the long months ahead, and to maintain their equipment through the harsh seasons. But it was the bear claw necklace that truly marked her progress. Silas wore it always, a string of massive claws from a grizzly he had killed in self-defense years earlier. The trophy represented not just his physical prowess, but his ability to survive in a world where death could strike without warning. "Tell me about the bear," Clara asked one evening as they sat beside the hearth, mending gear in the lamplight. Silas's hands stilled on the leather harness he was repairing. "Came across me fishing up on Dead Man's Creek, sow with cubs, which makes them twice as dangerous. She decided I was too close to her babies." "Were you afraid?" Clara asked, studying his weathered profile in the firelight. "Terrified," Silas admitted without shame. "Fear keeps you alive out here, long as you don't let it paralyze you. That bear could have killed me easy. They're faster than horses, stronger than 10 men. But fear made me think quick, move careful." Clara set down her own mending, a torn shirt that needed patching. "How did you survive?" "Used the terrain. Got myself positioned where she couldn't charge straight at me. Made her work for every step. When she finally committed to an attack, I had one shot to get it right." He touched the largest claw on his necklace. This was hers. "I wear it to remember that survival isn't about being the biggest or strongest. It's about being smart, patient, and ready when the moment comes." Clara understood the lesson beneath his words. In this wild country, her small size need not be a liability if she learned to use her intelligence and preparation to overcome physical disadvantages. Winter's first serious storm tested that philosophy. Clara woke to find snow piled 3 feet deep around the cabin and more falling steadily. The wind howled down from the peaks with a ferocity that made their walls groan and their windows rattle. "Storm like this can last a week," Silas said, checking their supplies. "A good thing we prepared proper." They had indeed prepared. The cabin was stocked with preserved food, split wood, and lamp oil. But by the 3rd day of the blizzard, Clara began to understand the psychological weight of true isolation. The endless white outside their windows seemed to press in on them, making their snug cabin feel smaller with each hour. "Gets to you, doesn't it?" Silas observed, watching her pace restlessly before the hearth. "The quiet, the being cut off from everything. I never realized how much I relied on knowing other people were nearby," Clara admitted. "Even in my small room above the store, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's rooster crowing, or the mill wheel turning. There was always some sign of human life." "One of the hardest parts of mountain living," Silas agreed. "Especially for someone raised in town. You start to wonder if the rest of the world still exists, or if it's just you and the wilderness. Forever." But Clara surprised them both by adapting to the enforced solitude better than expected. She used the time to organize their supplies, to plan improvements for the cabin, and to work on mending and reinforcing their gear. Her careful, methodical nature proved ideal for the detailed indoor work that winter demanded. On the 4th day, she made a discovery that revealed how much she had truly changed. While reorganizing their clothing storage, she found herself automatically sorting items by their usefulness in harsh conditions rather than their appearance. The green wool dress she had worn to the dance, the one that brought out her eyes, now seemed impractical and frivolous compared to the sturdy work clothes that had become her daily uniform. "I'm not the same person who left Cedar Ridge," she said to Silas that evening. He looked up from the trap he was repairing. "How so?" "That woman worried about what other people thought of her. She wanted to be seen as pretty, proper, acceptable." Clara gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall. "Out here, none of that matters. What matters is whether you can pull your weight, solve problems, keep going when things get difficult. And can you?" Silas asked quietly. Clara met. His eyes across the firelight, thinking of the bear she had faced calmly, the rifle skills she was developing, the storm work she had shared without complaint. "Yes," she said simply, "I can." The bear claw necklace glinted in the lamplight as Silas nodded his approval, and Clara understood that she was earning her place in this wild world, one challenge at a time. Winter deepened, and with it came both hardship and unexpected intimacy. Clara woke one morning to find Silas burning with fever, his powerful frame shivering despite the warmth from the hearth. He had pushed himself too hard during the previous day's hunt, spending hours in wet snow, tracking an elk that would feed them through the worst of the winter weather. "Just need rest," he mumbled, when Clara pressed her hand to his burning forehead. But when he tried to stand, his legs buckled, and she had to help him back to bed. For the first time since arriving in the mountains, Clara found herself truly alone, with the full weight of their survival resting on her shoulders. The nearest neighbor was a day's ride through treacherous snow, the nearest doctor back in Cedar Ridge. If Silas took a turn for the worse, she would have only her own resources to depend on. She drew on every scrap of knowledge her mother had, taught her about nursing the sick, cool cloths for the fever, willow bark tea for the pain, broth made from the bones of their preserved meat. But it was her small hands that proved most crucial when Silas's breathing became labored, and she realized his lungs were congested. "Need to break up the fluid," she murmured, remembering how Dr. Patterson had treated her father's final illness. Her small fingers could apply pressure to specific points on Silas's broad back, working to loosen the congestion in ways his larger hands could never manage. For 3 days, Clara barely slept. She tended the fire, prepared medicines, and monitored Silas's condition with the focused intensity she had once reserved for her finest needlework. When his fever broke on the 4th morning, she found herself crying with relief. "Thought I was going to lose you," she whispered, smoothing the damp hair back from his forehead. "Takes more than a little cold to kill me," Silas replied, though his voice was still weak. "But I might not have made it without proper nursing. Your hands, they're gentle but sure. You've got a healing touch." As Silas recovered, their relationship deepened in ways Clara had never expected. The formal politeness that had marked their early interactions gave way to comfortable intimacy. They moved around the small cabin with practiced coordination, anticipating each other's needs and sharing tasks without discussion. One evening, as Clara worked on mending by lamplight and Silas carved a new handle for his hunting knife, he broke the comfortable silence with an unexpected gift. "Made this for you," he said, setting down his carving tools and reaching for something wrapped in soft leather. Clara looked up from her sewing to find him offering her a hand-carved wooden comb, its surface polished smooth as silk. The handle was decorated with delicate wildflower patterns that spoke of hours of careful work. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate carving. "When did you have time to make this?" "Evenings when you were asleep. Wanted to give you something pretty, something that showed how much I appreciate what you've done here." Silas's weathered cheeks colored slightly. "No, it's not as fine as what you could buy in town, but it's perfect," Clara interrupted, genuinely moved by the gift. "No one has ever made something just for me before." As she used the comb to work through her hair, Clara realized how much their relationship had evolved from the practical arrangement it had started as. Somewhere between the storm work and nursing him through illness, genuine affection had taken root between them. "Clara," Silas said quietly, "I need you to know something about why I live up here alone." She set down the comb and gave him her full attention, sensing the importance of what he was about to share. "I wasn't always a mountain man. Had a different life once down in Colorado Territory, was married to a woman named Sarah, had a little girl named Emma. His hands stilled on his carving, and pain flickered across his features. They were killed during a raid. Bunch of desperate men, former soldiers turned outlaw. I was away on business, couldn't protect them. Clara felt her heart clench at the grief in his voice. I'm so sorry, Silas. After that, I couldn't bear to be around reminders of what I'd lost. Came up here where the solitude matched what I felt inside. He met her eyes across the firelight. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, and that seemed fitting somehow. What? Changed your mind? Clara asked softly. You did. His voice carried complete sincerity. Watching you face down that bear, nurse me through fever, handle every challenge this place has thrown at you. You reminded me that strength comes in forms I'd forgotten to look for. Sarah was strong in her way, but she never could have done what you've done up here. Clara felt a flush of pride at his words, but also a deeper understanding of the trust he was placing in her. Are you comparing me to her? No, Silas said firmly. I'm seeing you for who you are. A woman who doesn't need protecting so much as partnering. Someone who makes this hard life easier just by being willing to share it. That night, as Clara lay in her bed across the cabin from Silas's, she thought about the wooden comb and what it represented. In town, gifts between men and women were formal affairs, store-bought items that followed social conventions. But this comb had been created specifically for her, shaped by hands that knew her daily struggles and small triumphs. The winter community gathering came as a surprise. Clara had assumed they were completely isolated, but apparently there were other hardy souls scattered throughout the mountains. When old Henrik Larsen arrived on snowshoes to invite them to a cabin warming for a new family, Clara felt both excitement and nervousness about meeting others who had chosen this challenging life. The Sorensens built themselves a place up on Pine Ridge, Henrik explained, warming himself by their hearth. Young couple with 2 little ones. They could use friendly neighbors, especially with winter being so hard on families new to the mountains. Clara found herself looking forward to the gathering with anticipation she hadn't expected. After months of solitude broken only by Silas's company, the prospect of meeting other mountain families felt like a celebration. You'll like the mountain folk, Silas told her as they prepared to make the journey. They're practical people who judge others by what they contribute, not what they look like. The gathering proved everything Silas had promised and more. The Sorensen cabin, though small, was filled with warmth and laughter, as a dozen neighbors shared food, stories, and winter-fighting songs. Clara met families who had chosen mountain life for various reasons, some seeking freedom from social constraints, others drawn by the challenge and beauty of the wilderness. Most importantly, she was accepted without question or comment about her size. These people understood that mountain survival required diverse skills, and they appreciated her contributions to their small community gathering. Her fine needlework was admired, her nursing knowledge was valued, and her quiet competence was respected. "You found yourself a treasure, Silas," commented Martha Hendricks, an older woman whose husband trapped beaver in the high country. "A woman who can think on her feet and work with her hands is worth 10 who just look pretty." As they returned home through the snow-laden forest, Clara felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced in town. Here among the mountains, she had found not just acceptance, but genuine respect from people who understood that strength took many forms. "Thank you for bringing me here," she told Silas, as their cabin came into view, smoke rising welcomingly from the chimney. "Thank you for being brave enough to come," he replied, and in his voice she heard the echo of something deeper than gratitude, the beginning of love built on mutual respect and shared challenges overcome together. The wooden comb rested in her pocket, a tangible reminder that she had found her place in a world that measured worth not by size, but by character, determination, and the willingness to stand beside someone through whatever hardships might come. Spring brought more than just melting snow and budding wildflowers. It brought strangers to their remote valley. Clara first spotted them from the cabin window while Silas was checking their trap lines. 3 men on horseback, picking their way carefully down the mountain trail, their eyes scanning the terrain with the systematic attention of hunters tracking prey. Something about their purposeful movement made Clara's blood run cold. These weren't lost travelers or fellow mountain folk coming to visit. They moved like men with specific business in mind. She grabbed Silas's spyglass from the shelf and focused it on the approaching riders. The lead man was tall and lean, with a marshal's badge glinting on his vest. The other 2 looked harder, meaner, the kind of men who hired their guns to whoever paid best. Clara's hands shook as she lowered the spyglass. Lawmen didn't venture this far into the wilderness without serious cause, and the way they studied every detail of the landscape suggested they were following more than just a hunch. When Silas returned an hour later, Clara met him at the door with the news. His face went granite hard as she described the riders, and she saw something she had never witnessed before, fear flickering in his dark eyes. "How far out were they?" he asked, already moving toward his weapons. "Maybe 2 hours' ride moving." "Careful like." Clara watched as Silas checked his rifle and pistol with automatic efficiency. "Silas, what aren't you telling me?" He paused in his preparations, his broad shoulders sagging slightly. "Remember I told you I had a different life before coming here? I wasn't entirely truthful about why I left." Clara felt her heart sink, but she kept her voice steady. "Tell me now." Silas reached into his gear and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn from handling. He handed it to Clara without meeting her eyes. It was a wanted poster, and the face sketched in black ink was unmistakably Silas's, though younger and clean-shaven. "Wanted for murder," the bold letters proclaimed. "Silas McGraw, former U.S. Marshal. $500 reward dead or alive." Clara's hands trembled as she read the details. According to the poster, Silas McGraw had killed 3 men in a saloon in Denver, then fled into the mountains. The incident was dated 5 years ago, just when Silas said he had come to live in isolation. "I need to explain," Silas said urgently, seeing the shock on her face. "Yes, you do." Clara's voice was carefully controlled, though her world felt like it was tilting on its axis. Silas sat heavily at their table, suddenly looking older than his years. "Everything I told you about Sarah and Emma was true. They were murdered, just like I said. But what I didn't tell you was that I knew who did it. 3 men who'd been terrorizing settlements throughout Colorado. Frank Dalton, his brother Jake, and a half-breed called Crow." Clara sank into the chair across from him, the wanted poster still clutched in her hands. "I was a U.S. Marshal then, sworn to uphold the law. But the territorial government was corrupt, paid off by men with money and influence. The Daltons had protection, and my official complaints went nowhere." Silas's voice carried the weight of old bitterness. "So I waited, tracked them for months, learned their habits, their hideouts, and then," Clara prompted when he fell silent, "found them in a Denver saloon, drunk and bragging about their latest raid. They laughed about what they'd done to Sarah and Emma, described it in detail for the entertainment of the other lowlifes." Silas's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I couldn't let them walk away. Not after what they'd done, not when the law wouldn't touch them." Clara studied his face, seeing the pain and guilt that still haunted him. "So you killed them. Shot them down right there in that saloon. 3 against 1. But I had the advantage of surprise and righteous anger." His dark eyes met hers. "I don't regret killing them, Clara. They deserved to die for what they did. But I knew I could never go back to being a lawman after that. The badge I'd sworn to honor couldn't protect the people I loved most, so I left it behind." The wanted poster crinkled in Clara's hands as she tried to process this revelation. Isa, man she had come to love and respect, was a wanted fugitive, a killer who had taken justice into his own hands. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "Because I knew how it would sound. Because I was afraid you'd see me as a murderer instead of a man who lost everything and struck back the only way he could." Silas reached across the table but stopped, short of touching her hands. "Because I'd found something worth protecting again, and I couldn't bear to lose it." Clara looked down at the poster again, studying the details more carefully. The reward amount was substantial. More money than most people in these parts would see in a lifetime. No wonder bounty hunters were still tracking him after all these years. "Those men riding toward us," she said slowly. "They're not here for justice, are they? They're here for the money, most likely. Though the one with the badge might be legitimate. Law. Either way, they'll take me back to hang if they can." Silas stood, pacing to the window to scan the mountainside. "I won't let them hurt you, Clara. Whatever happens, you're innocent in all this." Clara stood as well, moving to join him at the window. Through the glass, she could see no sign of the approaching riders, but she knew they were out there, closing in on the life she and Silas had built together. "What are our options?" she asked practically. Silas looked at her in surprise. "Our options? You heard me. We're partners, Silas. Your fight is my fight now." Clara's voice carried a determination that surprised them both. "Those men aren't just threatening you. They're threatening our home, our life together. I won't stand by and let them destroy what we've built." "Clara, you don't understand the danger." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "I understand that the man I love did what he had to do to get justice for his murdered family. I understand that corrupt law and bought justice sometimes force good people to take matters into their own hands. And I understand that I'm not the helpless little woman everyone in Cedar Ridge thought I was." Silas stared at her, seeing something in her face that made him step back. "You're talking about fighting. These are dangerous men, Clara. Killers. So are you, apparently." Clara moved to the gun rack, lifting down the rifle Silas had taught her to use. "And so am I, if that's what it takes to protect what's mine." The transformation in Clara was complete. The timid woman who had been mocked for her small stature was gone, replaced by someone who had learned her own strength in the crucible of mountain life. She checked the rifle's action with competent hands, her green eyes hard with resolve. "They think they're hunting one man living alone in the wilderness," she said, turning back to face Silas. "They have no idea what they're really walking into." For the first time since spotting the riders, Silas smiled, a fierce expression that reminded Clara why the mountain folk called him Grizzly. "You're sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back to the quiet life." Clara thought of all the challenges she had overcome since leaving Cedar Ridge. The bear, the storms, the isolation, nursing Silas through illness. Each trial had revealed strength she hadn't known she possessed. Now, faced with the ultimate test, she felt that same inner steel rising to meet the challenge. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. "They want to take you from me. Let them try. They'll learn that some small packages contain more fight than they bargained for." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the peaks, and somewhere in the forest, 3 men continued their deadly approach, unaware that their intended victim had found something more powerful than any weapon, a partner willing to stand and fight. Beside him, no matter the odds, the bounty hunters made camp 2 miles down the valley, close enough to watch the cabin, but far enough to avoid immediate detection. Through Silas's spyglass, Clara studied their movements with the focused intensity she had once reserved for her finest needlework. "The one with the badge is Marshal Tom Briggs," Silas said grimly, recognizing the man's distinctive profile. "Honest, lawman, but he thinks he's bringing in a cold-blooded killer. The other 2 are Cutter Morrison and Pete Valdez, bounty hunters who care more about the reward than the law." Clara lowered the spyglass, her mind already working through possibilities. 3 against 2, but they don't know I'm armed or capable of fighting. That gives us an advantage. "Clara, I need you to understand something." Silas turned from the window, his face grave. If this goes bad, if they take me, you need to ride for the Hendricks place and stay there until it's safe to return." "That's not going to happen," Clara replied with quiet certainty. "We're not running, and we're not surrendering. We're going to end this here, on our terms." Over the next 2 days, they prepared with methodical precision. Clara's modified rifle, lightened and adjusted to fit her smaller frame perfectly, became her constant companion. Silas had spent hours adapting the weapon specifically for her use, shortening the stock and adjusting the sights until she could handle it with the same accuracy she brought to threading a needle. "Your size is going to be our biggest advantage," Silas explained as they planned their defense. "They'll expect me to fight like a big man, head-on, using strength and firepower. They won't be watching for someone who can move through spaces they can't see, who can get behind them or above them." Clara nodded, studying their cabin and the surrounding terrain with new eyes. The same small stature that had made her an object of pity in Cedar Ridge could become a tactical asset in the right circumstances. They prepared multiple firing positions around the cabin, caching ammunition and supplies at each location. Clara's sewing skills proved invaluable as she created camouflaged covers for their weapon caches, using her knowledge of fabric and disguise to make them virtually invisible. "You're thinking like a soldier," Silas observed with approval as Clara finished concealing their third supply cache. "Where did you learn tactical planning?" "From you, mostly, but also from being small in a world that values size," Clara replied thoughtfully. "When you can't win through strength, you learn to win through preparation and intelligence. I've been doing that my whole life. I just never applied it to actual warfare before." As they worked, Clara found herself reflecting on how completely her life had changed. The woman who had swept Henderson's store and endured the town's mockery seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone who could plan ambushes, modify weapons, and face down armed men without flinching. "Tell me about the men we're facing," she said as they checked their ammunition for the 10th time. "Briggs is the dangerous one, even though he's trying to do right by the law. He's experienced, careful, and he won't give up easy. The bounty hunters are ruthless but predictable. They'll take risks for money that a smart lawman wouldn't." Silas cleaned his pistol with practiced efficiency. "Our best chance is to separate them, deal with them 1 or 2 at a time, instead of facing all 3 together." Clara had been thinking along the same lines. "What if we could convince Briggs that you're not the man he thinks you are? If he knew the real story about why you killed those men? Maybe, but even if he believed me, he'd still have a duty to bring me in for trial. And there's no guarantee I'd get a fair hearing." Silas's expression was grim. Too many people had reasons to want the Dalton brothers alive, and dead marshals don't make good witnesses. On the 3rd morning, their waiting ended. Clara spotted movement at dawn, the 3 men breaking camp and beginning their final approach to the cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she checked her rifle one last time. "Remember," Silas said quietly, "if something happens to me, you get out of here. Don't try to be a hero. If something happens to you, those men won't leave a witness alive anyway," Clara replied practically. "So we better make sure nothing happens to either of us." They took their positions as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley. Clara's spot was concealed among the rocks above the cabin, a position that gave her clear fields of fire while remaining hidden from anyone approaching along the main trail. Through her rifle scope, she watched the 3 men pause at the tree line, studying the cabin for signs of life. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Silas's horse grazed peacefully in the small meadow. Everything appeared normal and unsuspicious. "Silas McGraw," Marshal Briggs called out when they were within shouting distance. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Tom. Briggs, I have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands where I can see them." Silas emerged from the cabin slowly, his hands raised, but his rifle within easy reach against the doorframe. "What's the charge, Marshal?" "Murder in the 1st degree. 3 counts. You're wanted for the deaths of Frank Dalton, Jake Dalton, and the half-breed called Crow, "Those men killed my wife and daughter," Silas called back. "I was a U.S. Marshal myself when I tracked them down." "That may be, but you didn't have jurisdiction in Denver, and killing them in cold blood makes you a murderer in the eyes of the law." Briggs's voice carried genuine regret. "I'm sorry for your loss, McGraw, but justice has to follow proper channels." "Proper channels failed my family," Silas replied. "Those men had protection, bought judges, corrupt territorial officials. They were never going to face justice through the law." Clara could see the uncertainty in Briggs's posture as he processed this information. The marshal was clearly troubled by the circumstances, but duty warred with understanding in his weathered features. It was Cutter Morrison who ended the standoff. "Enough talking," the bounty hunter snarled, raising his rifle. "Dead or alive, the poster says. I say we make this simple." The shot rang out across the valley, but it was Clara's rifle that spoke first. Her bullet took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The modified weapon's lighter recoil allowed her to maintain her position and immediately acquire her next target. "Sniper!" Pete Valdez shouted, diving for cover behind a fallen log. "There's another shooter up in the rocks." The element of surprise was gone, but Clara had achieved her objective. The three men were now scattered and confused, no longer able to coordinate their approach. She could see Silas diving for his own cover as return fire began spattering around the cabin. "This is your last warning," Marshal Briggs called out, though his voice now carried less certainty. "Surrender now, and I'll see that you get a fair trial." "Fair trial from whom?" Silas shouted back, working his way toward a better position. "The same system that let my family's killers walk free." Clara kept her rifle trained on Valdez, waiting for him to expose himself enough for a clean shot. Her position in the rocks gave her a commanding view of the battlefield, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they figured out her location and began concentrating fire on her position. The signal mirror Silas had taught her to use for long-distance communication sat ready at her side. If their defense failed and they needed to call for help from the other mountain families, the mirror could send coded flashes that would be visible for miles. But Clara hoped it wouldn't come to that. She and Silas had prepared for this moment, and she was determined to prove that their partnership could overcome any challenge, even armed men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their reward money. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and the sound of gunfire as the battle for their future began in earnest. Clara steadied her breathing, lined up her next shot, and reminded herself that she was no longer the small, helpless woman who had been mocked in Cedar Ridge. She was a mountain woman, defending her home, her man, and her right to live free from the judgments of those who measured worth only in size and conventional strength. And she would show these bounty hunters exactly what a determined woman could accomplish when fighting for everything she held dear. The gunfight erupted with deadly intensity as Pete Valdez broke from cover, firing rapidly towards Silas's position behind the woodpile. Clara's second shot caught him center mass, dropping him permanently beside his wounded partner. Her small size allowed her to fire from behind rocks that barely provided cover for a child, making her nearly impossible to spot or target effectively. "Where is she?" Morrison screamed, clutching his wounded shoulder while trying to locate Clara's position. Blood seeped between his fingers, but rage kept him functional. "I can't see the little witch." Marshal Briggs had taken cover behind a massive pine, his experienced eyes scanning the rocky slope where Clara's muzzle flash had originated. Unlike the bounty hunters, he understood tactical patience and wouldn't expose himself carelessly. "McGraw," he called out, "your partner just killed a man. This has gone beyond a simple arrest warrant. Surrender now, or we'll have to treat this as an armed rebellion against federal authority." "They shot first," Silas replied, working his way through the cabin's rear window to a position that flanked the marshal's cover. "And you brought bounty hunters to do a lawman's job. What does that say about your federal authority?" Clara used their exchange to reposition herself. moving with the silent efficiency Silas had taught her during their hunting expeditions. Her light weight allowed her to traverse narrow ledges and unstable rock faces that would never support a larger person. Within minutes, she had gained an elevated position that gave her a clear view of Morrison's hiding spot. The wounded bounty. Hunter was trying to bind his shoulder wound while maintaining his grip on his rifle, a difficult task that required both hands. Clara centered her crosshairs and waited for the perfect moment. "I'm bleeding bad," Morrison called to Briggs. "We need to end this quick, or I'm going to pass out from blood loss." "Hold your position," the marshal commanded. "I'm going to try to flank them from the stream side." Clara's signal mirror caught the sun briefly as she angled it towards Silas's position. 3 quick flashes that meant enemy moving east. It was a simple code they had developed during their months together, and Silas immediately understood the warning. As Briggs began his flanking maneuver, Clara made her move. She slipped down from her rocky perch with cat-like silence, using her intimate knowledge of every stone and crevice in their valley. The same small stature that had made her an object of mockery now became her greatest weapon. She could move through spaces where larger opponents couldn't follow, strike from angles they couldn't anticipate. Morrison never saw her coming. Focused on his wound and watching for threats from the cabin, he failed to notice the slight figure approaching from behind until Clara's rifle barrel pressed against the base of his skull. "Drop your weapon," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Morrison froze, then slowly lowered his rifle. "You're just a little girl," he muttered in disbelief. "How did you—" "I'm a mountain woman defending her home," Clara corrected him, "and you're bleeding to death unless you get medical attention soon. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to call out to your martial friend and tell him to stand down." "Go to hell," Morrison snarled. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Your choice. But if you think I won't kill you, remember that I've already dropped your partner. Your blood loss is making you weak and slow. I could end this right now and probably should." The cold certainty in her voice made Morrison reconsider. He had dismissed her as a non-threat based on her size, a mistake that had already cost him blood and position. Now, with a rifle at his head and death staring him in the face, he began to understand what Silas had recognized months ago, that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured by physical size alone. "Briggs!" Morrison called out, his voice strained with pain and defeat. "The woman's got me dead to rights. We need to talk terms." From his position near the stream, Marshal Briggs cursed under his breath. He had underestimated the opposition, assuming he was dealing with one man living alone in the wilderness. The presence of a capable female partner changed the tactical situation completely. "What kind of terms?" he called back. "The kind where everybody walks away alive," Silas answered, emerging from cover with his rifle ready but not aimed directly at the marshal. "You're an honest lawman, Briggs. Look at what you're seeing here and tell me this is how justice should work." Clara kept her weapon trained on Morrison while watching for any sign of treachery. Her small hands were steady on the rifle, her breathing controlled, her focus absolute. The transformation from town wallflower to mountain warrior was complete. She had found her strength not despite her size, but because of her willingness to use every advantage available to her. "One man's already dead," Briggs said heavily. "There has to be consequences for that." "There are," Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "The consequence is that men who live by violence sometimes die by it. Your bounty hunter friend shot first. We just shot better." The standoff had reached its crucial moment, with lives hanging in the balance and justice itself on trial in the wilderness court of the Rocky Mountains. Marshal Briggs emerged from his cover slowly, his rifle lowered but ready, his weathered face reflecting the internal struggle between duty and justice. He could see Morrison bleeding heavily under Clara's steady aim, Valdez lying motionless by the fallen log, and Silas positioned with clear shots on both remaining threats. "This isn't how I wanted this to end," Briggs said, his voice heavy with the weight of command and conscience. "It doesn't have to end in more blood," Silas replied, though his rifle remained ready. "You've seen what happened here. Your bounty hunters opened fire on a woman defending her home. That changes the nature of this whole business." Clara kept her weapon trained on Morrison while addressing the marshal directly. "You seem like an honest man, Marshal Briggs. Let me tell you something about the man you're hunting." "I know his record," Briggs said carefully. "Former U.S. Marshal, good reputation until the Denver incident. Then you know he served the law. Faithfully until the law failed him," Clara continued, her voice carrying conviction that cut through the mountain air. "Those men he killed had murdered his wife and child, and corrupt officials were protecting them. What would you have done in his place?" Briggs was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Silas and Clara. "The law doesn't allow for personal vengeance, no matter the provocation. The law also doesn't allow bounty hunters to shoot first and ask questions later," Clara shot back. "Yet you brought them here instead of coming alone to talk." "I brought them because I thought I was dealing with a dangerous fugitive who might resist arrest." Briggs looked at Morrison, still bleeding under Clara's rifle. "I was wrong about a lot of things." It was then that Silas reached into his shirt and withdrew something that made the marshal's eyes widen in recognition. A tarnished silver badge, the 5-pointed star of a U. "Marshal, I never stopped being a lawman in my heart," Silas said quietly. "I just stopped believing the system I served was worthy of the badge. But maybe it's time to see if an honest marshal like you can help change that." Briggs stared at the badge, understanding its significance. "You kept it all these years." "Reminder of what I used to believe in, what I might believe in again, under the right circumstances." Silas's voice carried hope mixed with wariness. "The men I killed in Denver weren't just murderers, Marshal. They were part of a network that reached into territorial government, into judicial appointments, into the very system we swore to uphold." "You have proof of that?" Briggs asked, his professional interest overriding his immediate duty. "Names, dates, payoffs, witnesses who were too afraid to speak up while those men were alive." Silas nodded toward the cabin. 5 years of putting together evidence that might actually clean up some of the corruption that's been poisoning justice in the territories. Clara could see the conflict playing out on Briggs's face. He was an honest lawman confronted with evidence that the system he served was compromised, faced with a choice between blind duty and true justice. "Even if what you're saying is true," Briggs said slowly, "you're still a wanted man. I can't just ignore a federal warrant." "No," Silas agreed, "but you could take me in for a proper trial instead of letting bounty hunters collect a dead or alive reward. And you could hear testimony from witnesses who've been silent too long." Morrison chose that moment to make his move, gambling that Clara's attention had shifted to the conversation between the two lawmen. He twisted suddenly, trying to bring his pistol up in a last desperate attempt to claim his reward. Clara's rifle cracked once, and Morrison's gamble ended with finality. Her shot was precise and decisive. The small woman who had been mocked as too weak to survive had just eliminated a threat with the calm efficiency of a seasoned gunfighter. "Damn!" Briggs breathed, looking at Clara with new respect. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "From the best teacher in the mountains," Clara replied, lowering her smoking rifle, "and from understanding that survival sometimes requires doing things you never thought you'd have to do." Silas moved forward slowly, his hands visible, the tarnished badge still gleaming in his palm. "Marshal Briggs, I'm willing to come with you for trial if you'll guarantee it's conducted in a jurisdiction where the Dalton network didn't have influence, and if you'll allow Miss Whitmore to testify on my behalf." Briggs looked at the badge, at Clara standing calm and competent over 2 dead bounty hunters, at Silas offering surrender in exchange for justice rather than vengeance. Everything about this situation challenged his assumptions about the nature of law and order in the wilderness. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "you just killed 2 men defending your home and your husband. How do you feel about that?" Relieved that they can't hurt anyone else, Clara replied without hesitation. And proud that I was strong enough to protect what matters to me. The marshal studied her for a long moment, then made his decision. I'm going to do something I've never done before in 20 years of wearing this badge. I'm going to use my discretion as a federal officer to suspend this warrant pending a full investigation. Silas and Clara exchanged glances, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing. This situation is more complex than a simple murder warrant, Briggs continued, holstering his weapon. What I've witnessed here today suggests there are circumstances that weren't considered when that warrant was issued. And frankly, after seeing how those bounty hunters conducted themselves, I'm questioning the wisdom of bringing in wanted men, or dead rather than alive. He walked over to examine the bodies of the two bounty hunters, his expression grim. These men opened fire on civilians defending their home. By any measure of frontier justice, your actions were justified self-defense. Clara lowered her rifle completely, though she remained alert. What happens now? Now I take statements from both of you, examine the evidence Mr. McGraw claims to have, and file a report recommending a full review of this case. Briggs looked directly at Silas. If your evidence is as compelling as you claim, there might be grounds for overturning that warrant entirely. Silas stepped forward and extended the tarnished badge toward Briggs. This belongs to the law, not to a fugitive. But Briggs shook his head. Keep it for now. Something tells me you might have earned the right to wear it again before this is all over. As the sun began to set over their valley, Clara reflected on how completely her world had changed. The small woman who had been dismissed as too fragile for frontier life had just fought off armed men and helped secure justice for the man she loved. She had found her strength not by becoming someone else, but by discovering who she had always been beneath the surface. Thank you, Marshal, she said quietly, for seeing beyond the surface of things. Briggs nodded respectfully. Mountain life. As a way of showing people's true character, Miss Whitmore, you've proven yourself to be exactly the kind of strong woman this territory needs. The badge in Silas's hand caught the last rays of sunlight, no longer a symbol of shame and exile, but a promise that justice might finally be served, not through corruption and violence, but through the courage of people willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of their size or circumstances. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of their cabin, watching a familiar delegation from Cedar Ridge make their way up the mountain trail. Word had spread throughout the territory about the corruption investigation that followed Marshal Briggs's report, about the vindication of Silas McGraw, and about the small woman who had helped bring justice to the frontier. The delegation was led by Widow Morrison, who looked decidedly uncomfortable as she approached the cabin where Clara had found her strength. Behind her came several other townspeople, including a nervous-looking Jake Morrison and Buck Wheeler, the same men who had mocked Clara at the dance. Miss Whitmore, Widow Morrison began formally, then stopped and corrected herself. Mrs. McGraw, I should say, we've come to apologize for our treatment of you. Clara, wearing a simple but well-made dress of her own creation, stood with quiet dignity on the porch. Her hands, now calloused from mountain work but still capable of the finest needlework, rested calmly at her sides. Have you now? Clara replied, mildly, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing her own worth. We were wrong about you, Buck Wheeler said, his face red with embarrassment. Dead wrong. When we heard what you'd done, standing up to those bounty hunters, helping to expose that corruption network, well, it made us realize how foolish we'd been. Jake Morrison stepped forward awkwardly. That night at the dance, the things we said, we were cruel and stupid. You proved you're stronger than any of us ever imagined. Clara studied the group for a moment, remembering the years of mockery and dismissal she had endured. But along with the memories came the understanding that she no longer needed their approval or acceptance. I appreciate your words, she said finally, But I didn't prove my strength to satisfy your opinions. I discovered it because I needed it, and because someone believed I possessed it all along." As if summoned by her words, Silas emerged from the cabin, the restored marshal's badge gleaming on his vest. His appointment as a federal investigator had been confirmed the previous month, giving him authority to pursue the corruption cases that had emerged from Briggs's initial report. "Folks from town," he greeted the delegation with polite neutrality. "What brings you all the way up here?" "We came to invite Mrs. McGraw to be the guest of honor at our harvest celebration," Widow Morrison announced, as if offering a great gift. "The whole town wants to show how proud we are of one of our own." Clara exchanged a glance with Silas, seeing the amusement in his dark eyes. "One of your own," she repeated. "I seem to remember being told I was too small and weak to be of any use to Cedar Ridge." "We were wrong," admitted Dr. Patterson, who had joined the delegation. "Completely wrong. You've shown courage and capability that puts us all to shame. What we'd really like," Widow Morrison continued, "is for you to consider moving back to town. We could use someone of your character and experience to help guide our young people." Clara felt a moment of genuine surprise at the offer. A year ago, such recognition would have meant everything to her. Now it seemed almost irrelevant. "That's kind of you," she said gently, "but I already have a home, a purpose, and a community that values me. I'm not the same woman who left Cedar Ridge, and I have no desire to return to who I was." She gestured toward the mountains that surrounded their valley, where other families like the Hendricks and Sorensens were building lives based on mutual respect and practical cooperation. "This is where I belong," Clara continued, "with people who judge others by their character and contribution, not by their size or conventional expectations." The delegation stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, realizing they had traveled a long way to be politely but firmly refused. "We understand," Reverend Walsh said quietly, "but please know that you'll always be welcome in Cedar Ridge, and that we've learned something important from watching your journey." After the townspeople left, Clara and Silas sat together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the peaks. On the table between them lay the newest addition to their home, a quilt Clara had been working on during the long winter evenings. Unlike her previous needlework, this quilt told a story. Patches cut from Silas's old shirts were sewn alongside, pieces from Clara's town dresses, creating a pattern that represented their blended lives. The border incorporated fabric from the clothes she had worn during the gunfight, alongside material from Silas's martial uniform, creating a visual record of their shared trials and triumphs. "Any regrets about turning down their invitation?" Silas asked, reaching over to take her hand. "None at all," Clara replied, squeezing his fingers. "I don't need their approval anymore. I know who I am and what I'm capable of." Silas lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. "I knew it from the first moment I saw you. Took you a while longer to figure it out yourself." Clara laughed, a sound of pure contentment. "I suppose it did. But some lessons can only be learned through experience." As darkness settled over their valley, they moved inside to the warmth of their cabin, the hearthstone that had welcomed. Clara on her first night glowed with steady heat, its carved surface reflecting the lamplight. Above it hung Silas's restored badge and Clara's modified rifle, symbols of justice and self-reliance earned through courage and determination. "What would you tell that frightened woman who left Cedar Ridge if you could speak to her now?" Silas asked as they prepared for bed. Clara considered the question seriously. "I'd tell her that being small in size doesn't mean being small in spirit, that strength comes in many forms, and that the right person will see your worth regardless of what others think." She smiled at her husband. "And I'd tell her that sometimes the most important journey is the one that leads you to discover who you were meant to be all along." Outside their windows, the mountain winds sang through the pines, carrying stories of other strong women who had found their place in the wilderness. Clara Whitmore McGraw had added her voice to that eternal song, proving that in the vast frontier of human potential, no one was ever too small to make a difference.